Welcome grade 12s to our first Life Sciences Telematics presentation for this year. I'm Marichen Vermeulen, a teacher at La Rochelle Girls High School in Paarl.
And I'm Yolanda Gibson, a teacher at Parklands College in Cape Town.
And today we'll be looking at an overview on human evolution. So we're going to get right into it, and Yolanda is going to take us away.
Right, so in your evolution module, you guys will obviously have seen that we will be covering quite a bit of work this year. One of the items that we will be covering will be the hominin fossils, the different types of species. We will be looking at the out of Africa hypothesis, just looking at how they're all related to each other, similarities between the apes and humans, and the differences between each of them. And today we are going to focus mainly on just normal human evolution without the species, so that you would need to go to your exam guideline, and obviously your teacher will be able to give you more information on all the different types of hominin species. Right, so let's dig into our very first PowerPoint presentation. This slide that we have here in front of us indicates our cladogram. So we can see here at the bottom we have our mammalian ancestor, our common ancestor to all of the apes that we have here at the top. And over time, we find that the organisms have evolved. And with each special new adaptation that took place, the organism changed slightly. So here we've got our squirrel monkey, which is obviously one of the first existing apes that existed. And then over time, we had additional features that added on, like for instance not having a tail, like for instance development of a larger brain and erect posture. So every time we have a branching point to one side, that's an indication that evolutionary divergence has taken place and an organism has developed from a common ancestor. So that branching point will have a common ancestor that all of these guys here will share, for instance. Right, so when we look at human evolution, this has now been over 6 million years in the making to have what we have in features today. All right, so you will quite often see that there's an abbreviation within a question paper where we talk about MYA. That abbreviation just indicates 6 million years. Right, so sadly, when it comes to the understanding of human evolution, there is this misperception that humans evolved from apes, which isn't technically correct. So when we look at the diagram that I've just shown you guys, you will see that we actually developed from a common ancestor. Now, this common ancestor might have features that are similar to apes, ape-like features, which when you compare your hominin species skulls to each other, you can see these features may be coming through. But at no point was there a chimpanzee and we developed from the chimpanzee. All right, so that's one of the misperceptions that we just quickly want to rectify. So going back to our PowerPoint presentation, they might ask you different questions based on the words that we see here at the top. So primates, first off, all of these examples indicate our primates. And then they break that down into specifically the family Hominidae, which includes your orangutan, your gorilla, your common chimpanzee, and your bonobo, so your great apes. And then we have our subfamily, which is Hominidea. And then we have what is referred to as the hominins and their ape-like ancestors. So when I use the term hominin, I'm actually referring to Homo sapiens as well as any other Homo-related species. And that can also include their Neanderthals as well. Right. Okay, so family of our hominins, Hominidea. If we have a look at the breakdown of it, Ardipithecus would have been one of our first species that existed. Then we have our Australopithecus, which started to develop shortly after that, which is more recent on our evolutionary scale. And then Homo are the most recently evolved species that exists. Okay, some of the examples that you would experience in test or that your teacher would discuss with you would include Australopithecus africanus, also known as Mrs. Ples. We will have Homo habilis, which is also known as handyman. We've got Homo erectus, and then we have the Homo sapien example, which is you guys. Right. So we're going to dig into some of the similarities that exists. Now, you might have seen these diagrams within TESOL exams or within the classroom environment, but I want you to think about this for a moment. So irrespective of the diagram with all the labels, imagine a chimpanzee was sitting right next to me. What would be one of the key differences that you would see in these two different types of organisms? And maybe one of the biggest differences would be the fact that the one will be knuckle walking on 4 legs, while the one walks on 2 legs. You will see, for instance, the length of the arms being different. Obviously, for a chimpanzee, much longer arms, as humans got a little bit shorter arms, and the pelvis might also be one of the key features that pop out immediately. So if we run through the similarities that we have between the two different organisms, we start with having an upright posture, right? We're not talking here about being quadrupedal or bipedal, but just in general having bones positioned in an upright position. We've got a larger brain relative to body mass. We've got the eyes facing forward, which we call binocular vision. You might have already covered this section in your classes, but binocular vision is the fact that you've got your 2 eyes facing the front, they've got overlapping fields of view, and for us that means that we've got depth perception. So we are able to judge how far something is from us, and for a chimpanzee that would obviously be very important if they're like climbing in the trees, jumping from one tree to the next, being able to judge how far the next tree would be, right? So we still retain that, having the binocular vision. Right, so let's continue through the rest of our list. We've got a poor sense of smell, so that is linked to our brain center being less developed in our cerebrum for the receptors to send impulses to the brain to be interpreted. We only have 2 mammary glands, long upper arms, okay, but as we can see in these 2 diagrams, humans are slightly shorter as opposed to our chimpanzee or our gorillas, which almost have their arms going up to their knees. Freely rotating arms, because we need to have these guys be able to swing from tree to tree, but we retain that ability as well. We've got flat nail beds and digits instead of claws, opposable thumb, sexually dimorphic, and we lack external tail. So just to get back to that opposable thumb, what they mean by that is when I look at my hand, the thumb can move about. That's opposable. So it moves about, we can grab things, we can hold on to trees, we can carry things, all of that. So when we compare, and we're going to look at that a little bit later on as well, when Marichen deals with the feet, we can see that the chimpanzee also has a divergent big toe, which obviously we don't have. So let's move to the differences between the chimpanzee and gorillas, or whatever the case might be. So in this image, we can clearly see that divergent big toe. So the rest of the toes are all parallel to each other, and this one is pointing slightly outwards. And that is because these organisms need to climb trees, and they use their hands and their feet for climbing. And obviously we don't do that anymore, so our toes are all aligned to each other. So going through the list of quadrupedal movement characteristics, these guys have a bent posture. Their body weight is actually quite large, their upper body weight. So for them to be able to support walking, they kind of need to use their arms so that they can move vast distances. So that's why we find that there's also a bent posture. We're going to discuss the shape of the spine a little bit later on, but that kind of does allow for that organism to walk comfortably on 4 legs. Okay, the foramen magnum is in a more backwards position as opposed to ours, which is more forward position, and that yet again assists in the movement abilities. So I want you to think about this for a moment. If I had to put something like a little piece of plasticine, like press stick on a pencil in the front and try and balance it, that's constantly going to tip forward. But if you put plastic or a piece of press stick on a pencil right on top of it and you're trying to balance that, it will be much easier, and that is what we see in humans. So our foramen magnum is shifted more to a centralized position, which yet again we're going to look at in more detail later on. Okay, moving to our next one, we've got a spine enters the skull more horizontally. The head is parallel to the spine, so there's a direct line from the spine into the skull. Arms are longer than legs, as we mentioned earlier. The pelvic girdle is longer and narrower in order to support the weight, and the big toe is divergent. For the human, we see that it's got an upright posture. The foramen magnum is in a more forward position, helps with the center of gravity. Spine enters the skull more vertically. The head is balanced above the spine, as I've indicated with the pencil example. And the arms are shorter than the legs. Pelvic girdle is wider and shorter to support the body weight. And the big toes are convergent, meaning they're all pointing in the same direction. Okay, so the advantages of bipedalism, yet again, this is a logical approach to it. If you had to walk vast different distances, which would be easier, walking, knuckle walking, using your forelimbs, or would it be to walk upright? So yet again, this is an evolutionary advancement that we see based on the skull's changes in the foramen magnum position, our spine shape changing, that would allow us to undergo these new ways of walking vast distances. But you also need to keep in mind what could have been a potential driving force for us moving in a bipedal way, and that links to the environment changing. We might have moved from a forest environment out onto open plains. So yet again, the question is why and what would be the advantages of walking upright? So if we're on an open plain, we're obviously walking upright, and you need to remember there are no trees. So the sun that shines on top of us, if we walk upright, only our shoulders and a part of our face will obviously get burned by the sun. But if you had to walk on all fours, there's a much larger surface area that might be exposed to the sun, meaning that you're going to get a little bit more toasty, a little bit more burnt. Not just that, but you will also find that we will be able to carry things. Our hands and arms are now free to carry whatever it is that we might have. So all of this will obviously be two major driving forces for it. So we're going to run through these advantages quickly. Okay, so if we look at the first one, increase awareness, and that links in yet again with that open plain. So we will be able to see further, we will be able to see if there are any wild animals coming on our way. Hopefully we will able to see where is a good place for shelter, able to see over the tall grass. So all of these will help for an organism to survive in a new environment, so making us better adapted for that new environment, and therefore progress the whole evolution into an upright posture. All right. So our next one that we have is freeing of the hands. This obviously allows us to carry objects and weapons and all of that. Exposure to surface area to the sun will be reduced, so less overheating over vast distances, and it will be easier to wade through water on 2 legs as opposed to having 4 legs. Okay, for reproduction purposes, the male will be able to display their genitalia during mating, and we will have a more energy efficient way of transporting.
Now, in human evolution, we start seeing some major trends over time. One of these is a change, as Yolandi has mentioned now, from knuckle walking or walking on forelimbs to bipedal locomotion. We're also going to look at changes to the skull and the palate, which is associated with a change in diet from raw food to cooked food. And the question is, what drove these changes to happen? There had to be some other selective pressure. So natural selection definitely was the driving force behind these changes. And it's estimated that about 10 million years ago, the climate in Africa was changing. Africa was drying up. So on the slide, we used to have a tropical forest where the movement was primarily focused on tree movement, like an ape swinging from one branch to the other. But now, as a result of Africa drying up, we start seeing a savanna, where the vegetation is much sparser and you have to actually move on ground. So the selective pressure now is applied to an organism that can move in a bipedal stance over greater distances without overheating, and also the development of a larger brain that allows for complex processing. So what's the evidence for this? Well, evolution is based on 3 pieces of evidence. Fossil evidence, which tells us of the physical appearance of hominids, and also a lot of it supports bipedalism, and we'll run through that. Genetic evidence, which Yolandi will touch on, giving us evidence about common ancestors and identifying how closely related 2 species could be. And then cultural evidence, which we won't spend too much time on today, which is evidence for complex brain processes, the development of weapons and things like that. Right, so if you are a scientist and you discover a new fossil, and you have to determine, where does this fossil fit into the human evolution timeline, there are a few things that you are going to have to look at that fossil in order to determine, is it more of a bipedal organism or more of a knuckle walking organism. And when you do in class all the different species with your teacher, you're going to see that there's going to be this gradual transition. And with the earliest of our ape-like ancestors, like Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, we start seeing this gradual shift towards more bipedal organisms. And it's important that you note the phrasing that we're going to be seeing on the slides now for your exam purposes, and that you use the correct phrasing when describing these characteristics. All right. So the first thing you look at is, where is the foramen magnum? And a bipedal organism has a foramen magnum that is located in a more forward position. So here we have 4 skulls. We have the chimpanzee here at number 1. Then we have an Australopithecus africanus, one of our ape-like ancestors, a erectus, and then a Homo sapien. And the hole here at the bottom is the foramen magnum, which we can see is shifting towards a more forward position, so that the head itself is positioned more centrally over the shoulders and the spine. If the foramen magnum is in a more backwards position, like here in the chimpanzee, you can see that there is a more parallel exit of the spine to the skull. The second thing that shows us a fossil is bipedal is the shape of the pelvic girdle. A shorter, wider pelvis is more characteristic of a bipedal organism. And this has all got to do with the position in which the body weight needs to be centralized. So you and I, we have a shorter, wider pelvis that centralizes our body weight above our hips and allows for better stability in bipedal walking. Whereas this gorilla has to have its weight distributed in such a way that it can support a knuckle stance or a quadrupedal locomotion. And this pulls on the spine. So in order to support the spine, you have that elongated pelvis that runs more parallel to the spine and supports it in this knuckle walking position. A third thing that you would look at is the shape of the spine itself. If the spine is more S-shaped, it's more likely to be a bipedal organism, meaning you have these 2 curvatures here, typical of a human spine, whereas with quadrupedal movement, we prefer to see the C-shaped spine, again allowing the position of the head to be a little bit more parallel to the spine, maintaining the body posture for knuckle walking. So the head, the spine, and the hips are all kind of running down one line, supporting the body weight in that knuckle walking stance. Whereas with bipedal locomotion, that S-shaped spine, or the more curved spine, helps to keep the head positioned above the shoulders. It's much better for shock absorption, as well as resilience, and it allows more flexible movement for humans. Then the next thing we look at is the length of the femur, as well as how angled the femur is in terms of how close the knees are together. So here we again can see the femurs of 3 different organisms. We have the chimpanzee, one of our ape-like ancestors, an Australopithecus, and a modern Homo sapien or human. And quadrupedal locomotion once again requires that parallel stance. So we have a femur that is much shorter than in humans, so you can definitely compare the length. And you can see that the knees here are not going to be close together. So the femur again runs more parallel to the midline of the organism, allowing for that knuckle walking and supporting the body weight in quadrupedal locomotion. Then with one of our ape-like ancestors, you can see that that femur is already getting a bit longer, a little bit more slanted. So that's why Australopithecus is an example of an ape-like ancestor that shares some of these bipedal characteristics with humans and therefore forms part of our human evolution. And then in humans, a much longer femur, very angled towards the midline, and the knees are close together to keep that central weight distribution above the hips, allowing bipedal locomotion to be more efficient. And then the last thing that they would definitely take a look at if you found these fossil bones would be the structure of the foot, right? So one of the famous fossils that you're going to learn about are the Laetoli footprints that are found in Laetoli in northeast Africa. And why they are so fantastic is because this is one of the first examples of a foot where the big toe is changing to be more convergent. So convergent meaning that it runs in line with all the other toes, compared to a divergent big toe, which you can see here in an ape, which would be similar to the thumb that we have in our hands. And the biggest function of a convergent big toe is for balance, maintaining balance. I don't know if you've ever realized how much weight you actually place on your big toe when you're standing in an upright position. They say about 40% of the load is actually carried just by your big toe. So definitely for a bipedal organism, a convergent big toe is a must. And then if we look at the side of the foot, we can also compare the arch and the heel bone. So remember, humans, we walk heel to toe, heel to toe. So the heel is much stronger and larger to absorb that impact, and we have a more stable arch in the foot also to support our body in an upright position. Because apes are really just hanging from trees and swinging from one branch to the next, they're not really using that heel to absorb much impact, so very weak and small, and the arch of the foot is very, very flat.
Right, in a test or exam situation, you might be asked to undergo a question where they have different types of skulls. And it might be between a chimpanzee or gorilla or a human, or it might be between our hominin ancestors. So they could put like a Australopithecus africanus on top and a Homo sapien, and they can ask you questions based on observable differences between the skulls that have been issued to you. Now, this can be the skull from the bottom, as we've seen earlier when Marichem was discussing the Foramen magnum, or it can be a side view. But the key word to remember is observable differences that they have given within the question itself. So you can't talk about, for instance, Foramen magnum if it's a side view of a skull. Alright, so today we're going to have a look at the human skull and how that does differ from a thing like, for instance, a chimpanzee or gorilla. So on our slide, we have a human skull here in front. There's our chimpanzee. And immediately we can see that the one's got a much larger, in this case, a much larger protruding snout as opposed to in the humans. We also see that there's a much larger cranium area as opposed to our chimpanzee, and also that there are differences within the jaw and our teeth. We're going to look at each of these in more detail shortly. So the first item of discussion is having a human not experiencing a snout or demonstrating a snout. We say that it is non-prognathous, or we can also refer to it as having a less protruding jaw. So this is very important that we use the terms non-prognathous when we are referring to this snout appearance within a chimpanzee versus that of a human. Okay, we also find that the foramen magnum is located more forward position. Obviously, this is not an observable difference in this diagram, so be careful when it's asked in the test situation. Right, we've got a large cranium, and this large cranium is to also house a much larger brain, which is then linked or can be linked to obviously more complex behavior, as opposed to our chimpanzee, which has got a smaller cranium. We've got a smaller jaw, smaller canines, well-developed chin, and less pronounced eyebrow ridges. We do not have a sagittal crest. As opposed to our chimpanzee, there is a protruding jaw, which we call prognathous. The foramen magnum is located more backwards to allow for that parallel entry into our spinal cord or their spinal cord. A smaller cranium. We also see a large jaw, large canines, poorly developed chin, pronounced eyebrow ridges, and it's got a sagittal crest which is present. So in this diagram, you might not be able to see the sagittal crest that clearly, but if you look at it from the front, the sagittal crest is sticking upwards. So we're going to have a little bit of a look later on to see why that's beneficial for a chimpanzee and why we don't have it anymore. Right, so our starting point is the dentition, which is the dietary changes that we have seen within the species over time. So on the image on the left-hand side, just for comparison, we can see there's a jaguar busy eating away on a raw carcass of meat there. But in your minds, you must imagine these massive sharp canines that is currently digging into that piece of meat. And as you can see, this guy's bracing himself to tear a piece of that meat off. So for a canine, having large canines, it means that you can sink your canines into the meat and then rip it off the bone. As opposed to this young child here to the right hand side, there's no ripping or tearing per se, or maybe there is, depending on if it's a messy eater, but they do not rely on large canines in order to bite into that cooked piece of meat. And the reason being is that when we cook our meat, it obviously becomes much softer. And through the fact that it's now softer, it makes it easier to eat it, it's easier to tear it off the bone, and therefore our reliance on obviously having large canine has been reduced over time. So this is all linked to the fact that our Homo ancestors were able to master fire and therefore be able to cook their meat, and over time we found that our teeth actually changed, and it's solely based on not having that need in order for us to cut or our teeth, or using our teeth to cut.
The muscles and the jaw required for that kind of movement.
Chewing. We're going to get to that in a short while, but we also found that these animals, having had the larger brain, they were able to come up with the use of tools, making tools and all of these things, so they can actually use a tool like a sharp stone to cut pieces of the meat off the bone. So yet again we move away from having this massive reliance on having sharp teeth in order to eat our food. Right, so we move to our next slide. So as we've mentioned before, there might be a situation where they give you the different jaws of different species, and they can ask you for observable differences that you might see. So first thing to note is within our hominin ancestor as well as in the chimpanzee, there's a much larger canine indicated here in the red, and between the canine and the incisors they have a bit of a gap there. And the incisor's job is to cut while your canines are there for digging in and helping to tear off. So that gap will definitely assist, and when you bite into the meat, to actually sink your incisors in and then helping with the ripping action to get it off the bone. So over time we find that obviously reduces, the need reduces going from our Australopithecus ancestor to a more modern human. So the gap, the diastema has now disappeared. The diastema is the gap between the teeth, completely gone. And we find that the teeth have also now reduced in size because we don't rely on actually chewing our food as much anymore. Okay, just a quick note that I want to make. When it comes to exams, I know that we're all used to quickly WhatsApping our friends and using shorthand, texting styles. But when we write down and we refer to canines in test situation, you have to write the term out in full. We have seen in past papers or even in our classroom environments where you rush for time and you quickly just abbreviate the canine as literally a K with a 9 next to it. Now that actually takes on a very different meaning. They refer to dogs as being canines and therefore would definitely be marked wrong. So phonetic spelling only takes you so far, and unfortunately you need to make sure that you write it out in full. Right, so just a little side note to make sure that you spell the words correctly. Okay, so we have our next slide. We've got a little bit of a, I'm rushing through this part here, but we've got our canines yet again, and we see our smaller teeth there in the back as opposed to these guys here, which have much larger teeth. Okay, yet again, they had to grind their food, really chew their food in order to make it more palatable for them and be able to swallow it. Okay, here we have our 3 skulls. Yet again, our Homo sapien in the middle. Here we've got like a gorilla. And there's that nice sagittal crest that we see at the top for the muscles to attach to it to help with chewing their raw meat or their raw food. Okay, large canines, yet again to sink into whatever it is that they're eating, while we don't see any large canines at all in a human. Okay, here we've got a little Taung child, which is also one of our hominin ancestors, and their teeth are slightly larger, more of a gap in between. There's more of a diastema in between the teeth as well. Okay, palate shape has also changed over time. If we compare the chimpanzee, which is more rectangular, U-shape, as opposed to our Australopithecus, where we see it becomes slightly more rounded in shape, and eventually we get to modern human, which is nice C-shape, or parabolic shape, and that is also yet again linked to our diet and all the food that we had to obviously cook and helps to eat, and the shape also assists with that. Okay. In terms of our prognathis, we can see the muscle attachment difference here. Yet again, for our chimpanzees and our gorillas, there's that sagittal crest, and strong muscle attachment will take place here. And yet again, strong muscle attachment to the lower jaw. So that will all allow for a powerful bite into the uncooked meat. Now, yet again, because we have not cooked our meat, we don't rely on having to chew our food as hard. Our muscle attachment is much smaller to our cranium as opposed to that in your gorillas. Right, here we can see our sagittal crest quite nicely. Here's the Homo sapien. Here we have another ape-like organism, and how much that sticks out. Now the eyebrow ridges also becomes more pronounced in our ape-like ancestors as opposed to ours, which is a little bit more reduced over time. So they will ask you, why do we find that the sagittal crest and the eyebrow ridges are more pronounced in our ape-like ancestors? And that's got to do with the fact that the eyebrow ridge is also like a buttress for the muscles when they take a powerful bite to withstand the pressure that exists. So, and the sagittal crest obviously is an attachment point for the muscles to the cranium itself. Okay, so to run through what we've already discussed within this section, so there was a diet change from raw to cooked food. Our ape-like ancestors ate raw food diets, which is mostly plant material that require more processing. Think about chewing on an uncooked bean, or even like mealies, for instance, that would really require a lot of chewing. Okay, all of the teeth, especially the canines, were much larger, more powerful jaw, and large chewing muscles attached to the ridge for a more powerful jaw movement. For our early Homo species, they used tools to cut their meat, and they used fire to cook it. So much more processing was required beforehand before eating your food. We found that there were smaller teeth, including the canines. There were smaller jaws, and we have an absence of ridges due to reducing the size of the facial and jaw muscles. From the teeth perspective, we also see that the enamel became much thicker over time.
So now, in terms of the cranial capacity, it's important to note this idea that Yolandi talked about now with regards to the muscles, right? So even today, when you chew, you can actually see the muscles moving here on the side of your face, and that's the muscles that connect here to your jaw to kind of move it like a lever. So the larger and more powerful the jaw is, the larger and more powerful the muscle needs to be, and the stronger the attachment is. So what happens is it's almost as if the muscle is exerting a very powerful pulling force onto the cranium by being attached to the eyebrow or the sagittal ridge. And as the diet changed into more cooked food and you started having a decrease in the size of the muscle, that pressure that was exerted by the muscle on the cranium was alleviated. So we start seeing an increase in the size of the cranium, and if you have a larger cranium, you have space to house a larger brain. So on the slide we have there 5 different organisms. We see the chimpanzee, we can see there Australopithecine, a Homo erectus, a Homo neanderthalensis, and a Cro-Magnon man, which is one of the earlier Homo sapien versions. And you can see that the cranial capacity here has increased over time, and this is due to the decrease in the jaw muscles that were pulling down on that cranium to lift this massive jaw up and down as this organism was chewing. And even though it seems as if Neanderthals had larger brains than we do today, it's all about where that brain was larger. When you do the nervous system, you learn quite a lot about the different parts of the brain, and you'll learn about this frontal cortex here, which is essential for your higher cognitive thinking skills. So overall, things that you do need to know for exams is definitely, why is a larger brain a benefit? Well, it allows for better coordinated movement. It gives you an option to process a lot more information in one go, so you can kind of solve problems much better. It allows for more complex activities like art developing, the discovery of fire and understanding how to use it, aesthetic appreciation, meaning that you don't just see a shell for a shell, you kind of make necklaces out of it, the development of religion, where you start burying the dead, and also the development of language and speech in a way to communicate with each other. And all of this was allowed by increasing the cranium size, which then housed a larger brain. Now, another important part of this section is the out of Africa hypothesis that you sometimes struggle with, although you kind of just need to know the gist of it, right? Which is in the statement, out of Africa. So according to this hypothesis, it basically says that all modern life evolved in Africa and it migrated outwards. So on the slide then, the basis of it in your telematics packet would be that all modern humans, Homo sapiens, originated in Africa and then migrated to other parts of the world. And like with any hypothesis, there should be some evidence for this. So fossil evidence is one of the biggest pieces of evidence, and then more today is the genetic evidence, which Yolandi will give us. Okay, so let's quickly look at the fossil evidence for this. So basically, the fossil evidence states the following. The oldest fossils of all our ancestors are found only in Africa. So the species that you will be studying includes the Ardipithecus species, which is the very first one that existed about 4 million years ago and is considered to be our earliest ape-like ancestor, exhibiting some bipedal features and similar features to more modern humans as well. So they are kind of the oldest ape-like ancestor bipedal organism, and we only ever find their fossils in Africa. Of all the fossils that have been found all around the world, none of them have ever been found outside Africa. Okay? Then you learn about Australopithecus. You get Australopithecus afarensis, which you find more in your northeast Africa, and Australopithecus africanus, Mrs. Plays, and the Taung child, which you find here more in South Africa. And once again, this species is considered to have evolved out of Ardipithecus. So it's the next kind of link. And the fact that we find this fossil only in Africa and nowhere else implies that life then originated in Africa. Then we go into the Homo species, right? The first one to appear is Homo habilis, the handyman. And Australopithecus was considered to be the direct ancestor of Homo habilis, and therefore Homo habilis, being the first of our Homo species, is going to be the earliest kind of bipedal Homo organism. So we only ever find Homo habilis fossils of all the ones that have ever been discovered in Africa. And if that's the start of our species, or our genus rather, then it means that we as a species also originated in Africa. Homo erectus is quite well known for having migrated out of Africa, so we do find fossils of Homo erectus in other parts of the world, in Europe, etc. But the oldest versions of this fossil are only found in Africa. And then modern Homo sapiens, our species, we find fossils of Homo sapiens in many parts of the world, but once again, the oldest fossils of Homo sapiens are only found in Africa. And that's the basis of the fossil evidence for this theory. Now, having gone through this, I actually found a really cool website that I want to show you. It's called the Atlas of Human Evolution. So for those of you who find this really interesting and want to go read up on it a little bit more, they have this amazing timeline that you can kind of scan through, and it actually shows you the migratory pattern of these organisms out of Africa. So I'm just going to run through it. The detail here is really not important. It's just pretty awesome to see it kind of spread. So this starts in the diagram at 2.8 million years ago, and they're showing you here the Great Rift Valley at the top there. You're going to learn about fossils like Lucy and the Laetoli footprints. They also actually summarize in the key for you some of the important fossils or artifacts that have been found. And here you have the cradle of humankind in the Gauteng highlands. So this is basically where our evolutionary history starts. We have the Australopithecus here, and then the Africanus here at the bottom. All right. So basically then, if we fast forward to about 1.6 million years ago, we start seeing that some other species have evolved and come onto the scene, like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, represented there in green. And we see that Homo erectus is the first to kind of venture out of Africa. And they move into Europe. From there, they spread to other parts, so we definitely find Homo erectus fossils in other parts of the world, but the oldest versions of these fossils are only found in Africa. And then Homo erectus will evolve into Homo heidelbergensis, which is represented here in kind of an orange color, which you'll learn about. And then we start seeing Homo sapiens come onto the scene, right? And the Neanderthals there in Europe. Now, Homo sapiens, they migrated for a second time out of Africa, and then we kind of world dominated where we are today. So it's pretty cool if you find this interesting and you want to read up a little bit more about it. You can go to the Atlas of Human Evolution and kind of flick through the maps, and they give you the key there. And it's pretty awesome to see all the evidence that has been collected over the years for this specific hypothesis. So what do you need to know? Okay, in your telematics packet, the following is stated. It says, fossils of Ardipithecus, the oldest one, remember, of our bipedal organisms as our ancestors, were only found in Africa, the Rift Valley, Ethiopia, or South Africa. Also, Australopithecus. All fossils of Australopithecus have only ever been found in Africa, the Rift Valley, Ethiopia, or South Africa. The first of our Homo species, Homo habilis, have only ever been found in Africa. And if that is the start of our genus, it means we also started in Africa. Yes, Homo erectus fossils are found in other places of the world, but the oldest versions of Homo erectus fossils have only been found in Africa. And also, the same applies for Homo sapien fossils. The oldest ones have only been found in Africa.
Okay, so that brings us to our genetic evidence. So as we know, when it comes to evolution, there are 3 different types of supporting portfolios of evidence to prove that human evolution has occurred and that the out of Africa hypothesis occurred. So we are focusing now on the genetic component of it. And for this part, you do need to understand a little bit about DNA and a little bit about what the sperm cell structure looks like. So a sperm cell, when it embeds inside an ovum during a process of fertilization, only the head portion of the sperm enters, and the tail portion and the middle section, which contains the mitochondria, actually falls off. So when we talk about mitochondrial DNA, the mitochondrial DNA is only passed from mother to offspring. The father does not contribute any of the mitochondrial DNA to the offspring. That means that we can actually follow the maternal lineage of a family as it is passed down from generation to generation. And because there's no crossing over, because there's no major events that could result in that DNA changing, that what you inherit from your parent, from your mother, will be intact, unless there was some sort of mutation that could have occurred. Right, so we're going to look at the genetic evidence quickly. So the genetic evidence, as we've mentioned, you have mitochondrial DNA. If your teacher hasn't told you this, yes, mitochondrial DNA does exist. And we quite often abbreviate it as just being mtDNA. So in an exam situation, make sure to write out mitochondrial DNA, and then after that you can shorthand refer to it as mtDNA. Right, now, in the diagram that we have alongside, this shows us how we are inheriting from the maternal side from generation to generation. The father doesn't contribute any of his mitochondrial DNA, and it's, as I've mentioned earlier, because the mitochondria in the tail portion, the middle section, actually falls off during fertilization process. So when we observe the mitochondrial DNA and we find that there are differences, those differences that exist from one parent to an offspring is as a result of a mutation that might have taken place within that DNA section. Now, every time there's a mutation, we refer to these as being markers. Now, to determine whether 2 populations are closely linked to each other or distantly linked to each other, we look and compare the mitochondrial DNA. So as soon as we calculate the number of differences within that DNA portion between 2 species or between 2 individuals, humans as well, we can establish how closely related they are or how recently they've evolved from each other, whichever the question is that we would like to have answered. So the fewer mitochondrial differences there are means that the 2 species shared a common ancestor recently. as opposed to when there are many differences or more differences, it means that the two species shared a common ancestor a very long time ago. Now, as Matric has showed us with that out of Africa hypothesis, it states that all humans originated from Africa and obviously spread throughout. We dominated the whole world. So when we look at the populations found in Africa, we find that there are many different markers as opposed to, for instance, in other country. So that indicates that there has been a long period of time that has passed, and that there has been time for these mutations to accumulate within the populations. So yet again, that's an indication to us about how old a population actually is, by looking at how throughout the world, how many differences there are within their DNA markers. We can actually then, through observing mitochondrial DNA, link it back to what is known as the mitochondrial Eve, which was the starting point to our Homo sapiens. Right, so we're going to take it a step further, and in our next slide, I just want to make reference to the Mind the Gap document yet again, which you will be able to find online. And within the Mind the Gap, they discuss how to analyze different phylogenetic trees. So you will find this extract there. It's on page 78. Now, all the work that we have covered in this lesson can be applied to these diagrams, and questions can be asked based on work that we have just covered. But obviously, being able to answer and interpret a phylogenetic tree is very important. So I'm just going to quickly run through the basics of this before we end off today, so that you know how to use this in a test situation. You will notice that there is some sort of a time indication that is linked to these diagrams, making it a phylogenetic tree. And when we are looking at the endpoints of such a tree, 1, 2, 3, and 4, the endpoints will indicate the descendants. In the test, they would usually write, for instance, like a chimpanzee here, and then like Homo sapien and Homo erectus, or whatever example they are giving to you that you need to interpret. Okay, the first starting point here at the bottom, that will be our ancestors, and then every time it branches to the sides, that's indicating a speciation event. So they have evolved, adaptation that they have undergone, maybe the environment has changed and they become more suited to the new environment. So we find that that will indicate a common ancestor to the different species. Right, so we're going to go to our next slide quickly. In the diagram that we have here, we have yet again the descendants indicated here at the top, and we've got a dotted line and a grayed line. So when we analyze this, this indicates unique history of bees. So for instance, that could be something that is linked to having an organism that is maybe contains diastema, while in this case here, the unique history that is linked to C could be the fact that the organism has no diastema. So that will be a Homo sapien, for instance, and this could be a Neanderthal or Homo or Australopithecus species. Right, so every time we find the branching points, that would indicate our common ancestors. So the common ancestor here will be linked to A, B, and C. The common ancestor here will be only for B and C as an example. So that could be an ape-like ancestor, which resulted in a Homo sapien and a Homo erectus as an example. Right. Okay, so just to quickly run through one exam question that we have seen in past papers before we end off our session for today. Yet again, we have our time scale here at the bottom, which makes this a phylogenetic tree. It looks like a tree, so therefore it's easy to identify one of these. And the question that is stated is to have a look at the human evolution that is represented. We've got a time scale here at the bottom, which is indicated in million years ago. So it's very important that we read what has been given. This is way back in time, and this is more recent in time. And if you were unsure, go and look for the Homo sapien, and then you would know, okay, this is recent, this is back in time. Okay, now the first question that they ask is, what is this type of diagram called? And that, as we've mentioned, is a phylogenetic tree. Question 2. According to the diagram, which organism, Paranthropus boisei or Homo habilis, appeared first on Earth? So let's quickly go and find the two organisms that to talk about. Here we have Homo habilis, and the other one, which is Paranthropus boisei, is right here at the bottom. So they wanted to know which one appeared first on Earth. So we look for the edge. Where does that bar, which indicates their period that they have been on Earth for, where did it start? And we draw a line straight down, and we try and read off of the time scale there. Okay, and obviously we can see that Homo habilis, as indicated, he was the first one to appear on Earth, and only much later did we find that Paranthropus boisei appeared, and that was around about at 2 million years ago. So question 3 then asks, name 4 species whose existence on Earth overlap with the Homo erectus. So we go and find Homo erectus. That bar indicates their existence period, when the extinction event occurred, when they originated, and they want to know want us to identify 4 species that coexisted on Earth. So that means that because Homo habilis, their period, it actually overlaps with Homo erectus. That's one example. We can clearly see Homo sapiens coexisted with Homo erectus during the same period of time. So then we go further down. We can see Paranthropus robustus existed and Paranthropus boisei. So there's our list as indicated. Okay, so we need to find overlapping bars with that piece of Homo erectus right there. Question 4, which organism was the direct ancestor of Homo habilis? So we find Homo habilis on our diagram, so we have it right here. And they want to know direct ancestor, which then of course is our Australopithecus afarensis, because that dotted line indicates to us that it's directly evolved from our Australopithecus afarensis example. Okay, question 5. List 3 characteristics that are shared by all the organisms in this diagram. Okay, so this links back to our very first slide that I discussed with you guys. So characteristics that they shared, which is olfactory bench sensor, which is reduced, binocular vision, freely rotating arms, rotation around the wrists, but they're asking for 3 characteristics, which means that in the test the marker would only mark your very first 3 examples that you have listed. So make sure that when you provide answers in a test situation that you choose the 3 that you feel are the most correct from all the lists that you kind of recalled in your mind, and then write them down. Writing 4 examples, we're not going to look for the 4 most correct. We're going to look at what have you listed one beneath the other as your first 3 examples. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our section on human evolution.
Yes, good luck with your exams.
All the best.